Hey, thanks for watching the podcast today. And Jeff, I am stunned to be saying to our audience that the Bible reading is from Numbers 25. And maybe if you peeked ahead, you're like me thinking, Jeff, Numbers 25. So help us. What are we looking for here as we think about being zealous for good works?
Literally, it's chapter 25 and verse 11 that's really brought us here, which is God's comment on the story. The story, of course, is God's people, Israel, in the wilderness, engaging great fornication with Moabite women and in honor of Baal and Baal worship, which brings a great plague from God down upon the people. Many are being struck dead in this plague. Phinehas, who is son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron, and thus one of the priests, in his zeal for God and right and wrong, takes a spear, goes and impales a couple in the very act of fornication in their tent. And God notices this, stops the plague.
This is a dark story.
It is. It's my kind of story. So verse 11, God says to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, has turned back my wrath from my people in that he was jealous, which is a synonym in Greek and Hebrew for zealous. It's kind of all the same area. Jealous with my jealousy among them. And so he gives them a covenant of peace and a perpetual priesthood because he was jealous for his God.
So
zealous for good works.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about this jealousy, zealousness. What exactly do you think that is saying about him? What's in his heart at this moment?
Yeah, I think, David, and we can be more explicit about this, is not a call to violence in the name of God in our day and time. This was a different situation. But the heart, of course, which was itself what got God's attention, that his zeal, his fervor for God's righteousness and God's right ways among the people, what it's saying is that we ought to be, part of our zealousness for good works, we ought to be deeply troubled by the sin around us. I'm thinking about what Peter says in 2 Peter about Lot, living there in Sodom, his righteous conscience, being tormented day by day, that we do not become so, comfortable in or used to the sin of the world around us that we actually begin to kind of suddenly lose our horror of it the same way that God is horrified by it. Not that we're going to act the way Phinehas acted, different time, different place, but in our hearts we share that same zeal that God's right ways be observed.
Anger is a piece of it.
Righteous anger oriented towards God's, it's not what's done to us, it's what's done against God.
Right.
Phinehas is not personally sinned against in this. It's not somebody raping his daughter or something. But Phinehas, as a priest in particular, is important. He's a priest. His job is to maintain the holiness of the people as a priest. And so God's honor, God's way, God's dishonor in this sin against him. Boy, is that, and so it is a truly righteous zeal in Phinehas.
It's an aspect of God that I don't think we think about very much.
Oh, absolutely.
And when we do, we're uncomfortable with it. So I'm thinking about the cleansing of the temple. I think we've already read about that this year.
But exactly.
And the fact that Jesus is driven in part by his anger with the corruption of his Father's house. And I think some people read that and are alarmed by it, but only because they haven't read their Old Testament.
And they don't understand who God really is.
And how many times has the Old Testament said that God's anger burned against the people, or with their idolatry later, God would send the prophets and express his anger with their wickedness. And so I don't think we think about that very much as a quality that we ought to imitate. And I do think that has a vital connection to good works, because I think there are a collection of good works that are stirred by anger. I think we ought to be angry about the corruption of our culture, and not driven by that to violence, but driven by that to wield the sword of the Spirit.
Right.
And rescue our culture. I think that anger with the advance of sin and the effective work of Satan ought to stir the righteous anger of God's people today.
Absolutely. And I think that includes, David, then, part of what do we do about it then, besides obviously not participating. We're not to take up a spear and go impale anybody like Phinehas did, but I think, responses, good work responses can be anything from motivation to evangelism, to supporting the elders in church discipline when they're dealing with sin in the flock. I mean, that's a way in which we remove the sin from among us.
It's interesting. I think people miss the broader picture of that.
That's right.
I think, and I've heard this so many times, my head's going to explode. Well, I just can't get behind kicking somebody out of the church. No, elders are dealing with sin in the church to the end of rescuing wayward disciples. And so to frame it that way is to frame it in an intentionally provocative way that is contrary to God's purposes. We ought to be pushing back sin wherever it's pushing it.
Right. It's not a social club. Part of what church discipline is really meant to signify is that in the elder's judgment, this person's in danger of hell. In other words, God's already kicked them out. We're just ratifying God's decision based on what we read in Scripture.
It's acknowledging where someone already is with God.
That's right.
The other thing that occurs to me, why this is so important, is I think that indifference is just the middle ground from acceptance. So we go from this place where we're opposed to something, and I don't think people typically leap from being opposed to embracing.
Yeah.
I think we move through this middle ground of being ambivalent about it right now. Homosexuality is a great example of that. I think more and more, even among God's people, there is just an ambivalence about that lifestyle. Yeah. And, well, it's just what some people choose. Who am I to say?
Right.
And now it's one of my grandkids, and maybe what I say is not such a bad thing.
Or people who view abortion as a political issue, and so you start talking about abortion, it means you're supporting one political party against the other or whatever. When it's a moral issue, if it actually has political implications, so be it. But first and foremost, why is abortion controversial? Because it is the slaughtering of God's innocent children in the womb. That's why it's, and if one party is, supporting that and one's not, or the politics are downstream from this. We need to quit worrying about what it politically means and simply sit there and say, where's our righteous anger?
It seems to me to process that on a political level is to process it on a far more trivial level. The far more important thing is that it is a horrific, offensive sin against God and against the innocent, and people ought to be outraged and angry irrelevant what party leans one way or the other.
That's right.
Whoever supports it of any race, of any political affiliation, whatever.
Right.
That's a deeply disturbing thing. That is a culture we would embrace it. It is the Old Testament practice of child sacrifice come to light.
Sacrificing the Molech
in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
I bet y'all couldn't believe we would get from Numbers 25 talking about homosexuality and abortion, but
maintain our conscience about this stuff. Zeal for good works, zeal for God's good works means righteous anger sometimes.
And I think when we're angry, one of the great good things about angry, that was a weird way to say that. One of the good things about anger is it is a powerful motivator.
Yeah.
And we're living at a time where people need to be motivated to godly responses about the things going on.
And godly concern in the first place about some things.
So maybe that's a good thing to think about as you read Numbers 25. Can my heart be stirred like the heart of Phinehas, to be angry and outraged about sin?